Hello Beastcoast Pokemon fans and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be breaking down the 2024 Latin America International Championships that just happened in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And this event is the very first international that we had a chance to have on Scarlet and Violet and also just the Switch. I can't believe that. I mean, James, the last time we were in LAIC in 2019 was Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, and you also won that event.
Yeah, November 2019. It has been 4 years since a major international in the Latin region.
Yeah, I think there were almost 400 players in the Masters division, which is incredible. I don't remember how large the previous LAICs were, but I want to say they were like 100 to 200-ish maybe. James, you might remember better. The numbers were a lot larger and it was awesome to see.
What's been really cool is just getting a chance to talk to the Latin American community, and they had the same sentiments to share. They said, wow, like this is the biggest LAIC we've ever attended, and also just the sheer amount of players now in like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, just like the whole Latin American region. It's exploded, and that's really exciting to hear about. We've seen that growth kind of across the board when it comes to video game and people playing VGC. So as I said, that extends into the reaches of South America as well. It was one of the more intermediate events that we had in terms of the meta development for Regulation E. And James, I know you and I talked about that a little bit in our LAIC preview, and also just kind of recapping the 3 events that had been led up to this one for the regional championships. But Aaron, we didn't get a chance to have you there, so I'm curious about your thoughts where the meta was or where you felt it would be heading into LAIC.
Yeah, it felt like there were a couple of archetypes that had really risen up. You know, Tornadus, comps in general, James won the very first Regi regionals with, and I think Tornadus continues to be really good. And so it didn't seem like there was any sign of it slowing down anytime soon. I think Roaring Moon balance comps made a pretty big reappearance. Paul Chu, of course, using it at the Toronto Regional Championships. And so those were 2 kind of general strategies I expected to be strong going into LAIC, and felt like a lot of the stream games were literally either like Torn versus Torn mirrors or Roaring Moon balance mirrors. And so I wasn't too surprised to see that. I think Trick Room is a little bit more niche, but it feels like there's always like 1 or 2 Trick Room teams in the top 8 of a lot of the regionals. And so whether it be like Dusclops or Saluna, for example, NDD Armor Rouge, I think didn't expect that to be as common, but generally, you know, didn't think it would like fall out of the meta. And so I don't think we saw Trick Room nearly like as maybe prevalent, but in the end, I think most of the teams from LIC weren't things that were super surprising. Gholdengo was something that I feel like has had a huge rise in usage. Part of it, once again, with James winning the first regionals with it. And so I feel like I was expecting to see a lot of Gholdengo, and we actually saw, I think, the usage stats where it had a huge spike from day 1 to day 2. So it just happened that a lot of the top players specifically had brought it and had good success with it. Yeah, there were a couple things that definitely weren't on my radar, like Chi-Yu plus Regieleki, for example, making it to the finals. Didn't know Regieleki in general was something that some people have been using, so that was really cool. You know, Regidrago was something that had been popping up a little bit more recently and had some solid performances as well. So there weren't too many like absolutely crazy things, and generally I expected either Roaring Moon comps or Tornadus balance comps, and it felt like a lot of the stream games did feature one of those 2.
Yeah, we casted a lot of mirrors, or like casted a lot of matches that were maybe 4, 5, or 6 Pokemon shared across the board, all just built a little differently. I don't know if that makes for a good stream experience or not for the people watching at home. I feel like the nuances of matches like that is always really cool to just be able to break down and also see some of the Pokemon performed at just a high level in that regard. James, like, what was your experience playing in the event? What did you face, or what were you kind of expecting to see versus what you did get?
Overall, I think most of it is how I expected it, where it was basically just like a lot of teams that we talked about in our preview. It was the Roaring Moon balance. I think I only played 2 of those though. Played quite a few Tornaduses. Then I kind of played a mix of where it wasn't really like Tailwind balance, sort of, where like they had the Roaring Moon instead, kind of like that Terra Poison breaking swipes that we saw Jamie Boyd run. And I think that kind of picked up a little bit more, so I ended up facing a few of those compositions. But overall, I felt like I played pretty standardish teams for the most part. I played like Trick Room, I played Tailwinds, I played just late teams that didn't even have either composition, just kind of went straight forward. So not really too many surprises. I wouldn't say like I faced too many crazy teams out there, but I would say like the teams you see in the day 2 are pretty much what I played for the most part.
I was really surprised by the amount of Farigiraf that we saw for this event. Even just kind of looking at the day 2 teams, or even just some of the teams that we featured on stream. I feel like Farigiraf has always been a little bit of a part of the conversation, just given the Armor Tail ability. I'm really curious to hear both of your thoughts on the state of like priority in this meta right now, and maybe why we were seeing a bit more of Farigiraf and Gastrodon, just any type of like kind of redirection in that regard.
Yeah, I think Farigiraf's an interesting one. I didn't realize that Rinya, the creator of Rinya's son, had made like this Farigiraf team led popped up towards the end of, I think, September, and they did really well on the rank ladder with. And so a lot of people brought back team to the Toronto Regional Championships, and we actually had like a mirror match on stream. I remember like featuring the exact same 6, but it was like, Farigiraf, Chien-Pao, Rillaboom, I think like Urshifu. That team also had Assault Vest Heatran. I think Farigiraf is interesting place because there is a lot of priority. You've got things like a lot of fake out, for example. I think being able to deny fake out in Branding with Trick Room in itself is really strong. You also have Prankster Taunt let you deny, and there are a fair amount of attackers still. Like, I mean, Dragonite's still around. You still have Sucker Punch users like Chien-Pao and the King Gambit as well, for example. I don't think Farigiraf necessarily fits onto every team, but it just provides good support and can deal decent damage when put in the right position. I actually recently tried a set that reached like rank number 1 on the ladder with Throat Spray, and I think a lot of the sets I've seen use like Citrus Berry or Safety Goggles, for example. And so some are more support oriented, some are more damage oriented. I think it's a really good Pokemon, but sometimes it can be a little bit awkward to have on the field where it doesn't necessarily do a lot of damage, especially against like your steel types like opposing Heatrans, for example. But I think it does provide a lot of utility, so I'm not surprised to see people pick it up more. That being said, it's not something that I think necessarily fits onto every team.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. I think I played 2 Farigiraf. They were day 1. I think there was only 1 in day 2, but I've heard a lot of players actually saying that they faced out like 3 or 4 like Rinya teams throughout their run. So it was definitely a team that like we saw quite a bit, but I think they kind of fizzled out in the day 1 specifically. So it's a strong team. It's just like a little bit tough because a lot of players will know that matchup. Compositions, like we've seen a lot of bulkier builds with like Tornadus and Fluttermane, which kind of give Rinya a little bit of trouble because they're not exactly the bulkiest mons out there. And if you're not getting those KOs, you could just get KO'd back, and then it's like a really awkward position afterward.
I always feel like when I look at Farigiraf, I expect it to be really bulky, and then it's just not nearly as bulky as I really wish that it could be for a given team. But when you look at some of the other supportive options that were really available during LAIC, like my mind still goes back to Redirection. I feel like Clefairy made a bigger appearance at this event, and then also just looking at Amoonguss usage, that Pokemon did way better at LAIC than I feel like we have seen it in previous regionals. And so I'm also curious what you both think about kind of other supportive Pokemon like that we did see have a jump in usage for an event like this.
Yeah, I think Amoonguss is always just good. I feel like every time its usage rate is not that great, I'm always like, why is this the case? I think when the format first started, Ogerpon became a thing, right? And so Ogerpon naturally is a pretty good Amoonguss matchup, but Amoonguss is still just incredible. And I think with Terra, right? Like being able to Terra, survive an attack, and get a Spore off is just such a big deal. We saw NDD being used as support, which also made it to the finals, and I think that was really cool. It reminds me a little bit of Farigiraf, where you can deny the priority attacks using the Psychic Terrain, but that also helps out against like Rillaboom, for example. And of course, unlike Farigiraf, NDD can actually go for Follow Me and Redirection as well. And so NDD has felt a little bit underplayed outside of like NDD Armarouge comps, and so I thought that was really cool to see. I wouldn't really necessarily always call Hisuian Arcanine support because it can deal a lot of damage, but yeah, I mean, that's another Pokemon that is won like 5 majors in a row now, which is absolutely crazy. Like if you told me to bet on which brand new Pokemon from Legends Arceus would be like the most relevant when they were first introduced, I don't think I would have guessed Hisuian Arcanine, because I would be like, oh, Fire Rock, that typing doesn't really feel that great, but this Pokemon's just been on an absolute tear, and it doesn't seem like there's any sign of it stopping. Like it's just so flexible and really strong into so many teams. Otherwise, in terms of support, looking at the day 2 teams, like we saw Bronzong in 10th place, which I thought was really cool. It was a body press skill swap Trick Room Iron defense set, so skill swap in particular, pretty underplayed move, but we used to see it a lot back in the day in like VGC 2012. Iron Bundle, something that's been popping up more. Alex Gomez brought Salamence, which we saw at the Toronto Regional Championships, but he used a more supportive set with Tailwind, Roost, Draco Meteor, and Air Slash with Rocky Helmet, which I thought was a really cool pick. Now, this is leaning outside of support Pokemon, but James, you brought Brambleghast. We've seen Brambleghast, of course, at the World Championships earlier this year. I thought that was really neat as well. And then Clefairy, as you called out, Rose, I think a Pokemon that had been rising in usage, and it's just a really valuable Pokemon thanks to its ability, but it isn't necessarily the easiest to use because you can't deal that much damage with it. Yeah, there's a lot of good redirection users in the format. Amoonguss, Clefairy, and NDD all had strong performances in this tournament.
Yeah, redirection is just always going to be something that's super solid. Not too surprising to see Amoonguss come up. Like, sure, it probably fell off in the beginning because like Ogerpon was pretty common. You could Follow Me, redirect a Spore. You actually had a switch into Spore that way. It was also always threatened with Terra when it's Fire Ogerpon being probably one of the most common. And if you want to Terra Water, like even the Water Ogerpon can hit it with a really strong Grass move. Right now, I felt like going into this tournament, there was a lot of disrespect for Amoonguss in general. A lot of players were dropping their safety goggles or their Terra Grasses, so you just didn't have as much as a spore counter. So like Amoonguss is just always going to be good. We saw it on how like strong it can be with like Pollen Puff, Redirection, Spore. Like it's just a crazy mon. So like it can sponge up attacks. It's pretty good. Even like the Trick Room matchups, like hard Trick Room, normally they would run like in the beginning of the Scarlet Violet season, they would run like Terra Grass Armor, for instance. That kind of dropped when Amoonguss usage dropped because they ended up changing to Terra Psychic. So now that Amoonguss can actually be a threat to like Trick Room compositions more commonly because they've been running less goggles or Terra Grasses, and going for Spore makes it actually really good into that composition. So it's not like too much of a surprise. The Gholdengo usage, like sure, you do still have a switch into Spore, but like overall, I felt like Amoonguss was a pretty solid bring. Ogerpon, of course, we saw a bit more come up and do pretty well at this event. Inity, I think, is like a really strong redirector. That Psychic Terrain helps against priority as well. And even we saw Paul Reyes bring Sinistcha, which had a really cool set to help support the King Gambit that he used to run SD on, and Terra Poise as an interesting adjustment there.
I love that you guys bring up the like changes just in Amoonguss and just respect, and also in the moveset. One set that actually stood out to me was Riley Factura's in top 8. He ran the exact same 6 that he had been using over the course of the last few tournaments, but one change that he made in particular is that he dropped Protect and he added Clear Smog. So I thought that was a really unique choice to change up something that was super familiar for him, and we did see a lot of Defiant users as well as just Milotic, I think, made a bigger appearance at this event. Like, valuable bring, you think, to drop Protect and add this instead?
Amoonguss, it's interesting because I think it really affected on Riley's team. So me and Emilio talk about like Protect on Amoonguss, and we think like if you don't have Protect on Amoonguss, it kind of makes it like easier to double target. That's one of the downsides to not running Protect, because it's like if Amoonguss can't protect, you don't have to fear like, hey, I could just double up into safely, maybe KO it or pin it, and then I'm in a really good spot. So you have to make sure Amoonguss is a bit safer in this case if you're not running Protect. But the Clear Smugs made sense for him. His team had a few issues, which were mainly Dundozo, which of course is just like a Pokemon that could be brought to this tournament. And one big thing was Kommo, which we saw him play in the finals of the Sacramento Regional Championship, where the Kommo was a really big problem Pokemon because he couldn't really hit it after an Iron Defense. The way that Clear Smog Amoonguss helps against the Kommo matchup is because he's able to go for Clear Smog into the Kommo, and if Terra Steel, then you force it to Terra Steel, which means she Empower with Sacred Sword, ignoring the defense increase, you'd actually be able to hit it and do actually like a good amount of damage. He actually told me he was actually running Terra Blast, Terra Fairy for a bit, specifically for Kommo, but then just decided to run Clear Smog afterward.
So kind of a big, yeah, maybe you're just a big problem there. I don't know if I would want to deal with a Kommo either, to be fair with you. But you know, something else that we saw that I feel like we need to touch on is something else that you had mentioned, Aaron. That was Brambleghast. I'm so glad that you brought that up because I feel like looking around, I saw way more Brambleghast than I expected to see, but I was hoping to see, especially knowing that we had new TMs come in through the Teal Mask DLC. We now have Poltergeist, and James, you were running that Brambleghast, and so I was curious if you could give some insight onto why you thought that that Pokemon was the right bring to have in a meta like this for a tournament.
Yeah, sure. So Brambleghast is actually something that I was pretty locked in even before Toronto. It was something I was exploring for like quite a bit. At the beginning of Regulation E, I thought it wasn't that great anymore, mainly because there were like so many problems with like, oh, there's a lot of helmets still. There's a lot of problems where Grassy Glide Real Boom becomes a bit annoying. Like Tailwind wasn't nearly as common because Tornadus usage was super down. So it wasn't a Pokemon I was planning to use again. But after like the rise of Tailwind just continued to dominate events, like especially like the Chuppa Sandvi team that ended up winning regionals back to back, like Tailwind was pretty much everywhere, even on the Roaring Moon stuff. So it's like, okay, against opposing Tailwind mirrors, Brambleghast is one of the strongest mons, especially in the Tornadus or Shifu mirrors, because you're just able to ignore the Tornadus for the most part, unless they have Air Slash for some reason or some other crazy move. You're able to ignore the Tornadus slot. If they want a Bleak Wind, they give you a +1, so it's hard for them to cover swaps. And then you can just focus down on the other position where it's like, oh, if there's a Flutter Mane, I can knock it out with like a Poltergeist or Power Whip, as well as our Shifu. So it's a really strong mon in that aspect where it can kind of make Tornadus just go for Tailwind, but it can't really do too much else. And I felt like it was just a really strong call going into this event because I assumed that Tailwind was going to be like one of the most popular things that I would face at this tournament, and I was pretty much correct on that. I think a lot of the top players did end up bringing Tailwind to this event.
You know, I think in terms of other offensive threats, I feel like we also pointed out a few others that maybe we weren't expecting to see or just had way more usage than we had seen at previous tournaments. And one of those was Regidrago. Regidrago. I saw more than a handful of these make day number 2, and even more so looking at the tournament as a whole. There were way more than I had personally expected. So where do you guys feel like Regidrago fits into this? And do we get a chance to see more of it, you think, as we look at the next few Regulation E events?
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, right? I think a lot of people were actually talking about this Pokemon before Worlds this year, and I actually expected to see more of it at Worlds because it felt like one of the more dominant Pokemon, but a lot of players just ended up not bringing it. I think, the biggest weakness of Drago is if you don't Terra, then you're weak to a lot of common types, especially Fairy, and you can't hit Flutter Mane, for example. But that's why people put it on these Tailwind comps, and you're often going to use a defensive Terra like Steel. And I noticed Joe, actually, who ended up finishing 8th place at LAIC, had a Poison Terra Regidrago, and so Poison Terra is something people are using a little bit more as well. The general idea is if you can clear the Flutter Manes and the Fairy types, then it just completely opens the door for Drago. So I don't think it's necessarily the easiest Pokemon to use, because sometimes you lead Tornadus Regidrago, your opponent just leads Flutter Mane, and you're caught in a really awkward situation. But if you're able to eliminate those 1 or 2 things that can resist or are immune to Drago's attacks, like late game Dragon Energy is just unbelievable. And of course, a Draco Meteor does a lot of damage as well. So I think it is obviously incredibly powerful, but not necessarily the easiest to use, because there are a lot of Pokemon that actually threaten it before you're able to, consistently get knockouts with it.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the stronger picks out there. I was using it a lot for Worlds. It's absolutely incredible, but it's not like it has its downsides. One of the problems is its speed tier. It's not exactly super amazing. It's base 80. So in a Tailwind Mirrors, it's usually one of the slower mods out there. And in Tailwind, you don't even outspeed things like Booster Flutter Mane or Booster Speed, Iron Bundle. So it definitely can be a little bit awkward in that department. I think one thing that helped Regidrago rise a bit was the team that Raga brought to Toronto Regionals and got top 4 with. And it ended up being really solid, where he had the Scarf for Shifu. He had a support Arcanine. I think Joe ended up going with an Assault Vest Arcanine to help switch into Flutter Mane a bit easier. And I think just the combination of being able to go for Dragon Energy, Make It Rain, especially with Heatran as one of the best probably normal switches of the duo, because Regidrago can carry Earth Power and threaten Heatran. You can cover it with a Make It Rain Earth Power combination, and then Heatran can't switch in. You can obviously, like we see in Gholdengo, Regidrago, Make It Rain covers for the Fairy types that want to switch in. And I think Rillaboom having Grassy Glide also helps with that combo, just because you can actually threaten Flutter Mane a bit easier. So Regidrago can have the ability to sweep more potentially.
Joe's team was really unique, but even when you look at the rest of the top 8, we got a ton of different team archetypes as well as just Pokemon, and also a very diverse top 8 in terms of where these players were from that actually ended up making rounding out the top 8. And so while Joe's team had their Regidrago, we actually had Esteban that had a Trick Room option there with the Cresselia, and then Victor Medina I feel was running things that were pretty standard alongside Marco Silva. Europe feels like they tend to just kind of lean into what is really good, but maybe just with a bit of a twist that makes it their own. And then kind of in the middle there, Josh Lorsey, he had a great tournament, and he was bringing some more of the Roaring Moon, but you also had Hearthflame Ogerpon kind of stuck in there. David Rodriguez, this is his best tournament performance to date, and he was using more of the Tornadus and Urshifu. But I think all eyes, Aaron, you called it out so early on, all eyes were drawn on Thiago Lattanzi's team that he ended up making the finals with. And I feel it just brings together so many of the pieces that we were talking about that were underexplored heading into this event.
Yeah, I'd say out of all the top 8 teams, that's the one that really drew my attention, mainly because it features Regieleki, and Regieleki had seen really low usage rates this year. I brought a physical Alecki set to Pittsburgh regionals, and it was kind of fun, but not exactly the most consistent. I love seeing Thiago's team, honestly. I think it's hyper offense that makes a lot of sense in a format where there are a lot of opposing Tornadus teams, because you're able to utilize Regieleki to drop opposing speeds. Alecki itself has a really good matchup in the Tornadus as well. And Chi-Yu is a Pokemon thing that's actually really fallen off in Regulation E, so it's cool to see it dominate so much on his team. And there was one game where just Chi-Yu got so many knockouts. I think it literally just clicked Heat Wave a couple times and KO'd everything. I think this was the maybe junior division finals, a Life Orb, I think single target Heat Wave got a 1-hit knockout onto Water Urshifu. It's just Chi-Yu can deal so much damage if you hit your attacks, because Heat Wave and Overheat are obviously not the most consistent. But yeah, I thought the Alecki call was really cool. I think you could see where it's a little bit weak if you watch the finals between him and Marco, because Marco was okay, I'm just going to switch in Iron Hands and Amoonguss, and your Regieleki is going to have no offensive pressure at all. Thiago's team, I think, is also not the easiest to execute. It might seem easy because there's so much offense, but a lot about it is positioning your offense properly. But it was honestly a real pleasure to watch him play. And yeah, I think I'm just happy to see someone have a really good performance with Regieleki, because very few players have even explored this Pokemon, let alone bringing it to a tournament. And it looked really good in some of the games he had.
Yeah, and it was pretty set in stone, like pretty early. I actually remember getting warning about this team, like after Toronto Regionals exactly, and it's like this is a pretty common team in Brazil, like expect to face at this tournament. And yeah, I ended up facing like quite a bit on the ladder, so it was definitely pretty unique here. Like the Regieleki was bulky, the Tornaz actually was running 28 speed IVs rain dance for, I guess, like the sunny day situation where if they have 28 speed IVs, so if they were facing a sunny day Tornaz, they would always get their weather prioritized as well. So it was really interesting. The Focus Sash Fluttermane, we really don't see too much, but the fact is that Fluttermane can protect and also have a safety measure of just being able to take one attack guaranteed, especially when like you look at this team, it's kind of frail for the most part. You do have a bulky Regieleki and a bulky Ogerpon, but they're not exactly classified as the bulkiest mons out there. So just, I think some really strong adaptations here that can like if I'm not getting a KO, even with these strong moves, I can probably survive at least one attack if you have this much bulk to survive it. And then I'd be able to outspeed because I have that speed advantage with that Regieleki.
It was really cool to see this team in action. And while we talk about like how difficult a team this is to actually pilot, I think Thiago Lattanzi as a player is kind of the perfect person to do that. Not only does he play, I feel like, a little bit off the cuff in some situations you might expect him to do, but also he's a grinder. Like he's always on ladder. He's playing a ton online, and also he's been to 4 major tournaments, including this one, and he's gotten top 16 or better at all of them. I think this is a player that has a really bright future, and he clearly takes like a very creative approach to his team building and the way they actually executes game plans. So I'm pumped to see what he's gonna do here. Both Thiago and Marco ended up getting automatic Worlds invites with their finalist placements at IC, which is a welcome new change to the circuit that we've seen this year. But there's a bunch of other talking points I feel like for this top 8 that really make me excited for the rest of Regulation E.
Yeah, I think for me, my favorite thing about LAIC is the LATAM community and seeing which LATAM players are able to rise up in particular, since we don't get to see them play as much. And so, yeah, Thiago, I know he won like a big victory road grassroots right before the World Championships last year. And yeah, I think it was Gabriel Gatti that tweeted he had gotten like top 60 or better at all the events he's played in. I think this was his first IC as well, and he almost won the whole thing. And with a, I think, cool team, especially with the Regieleki. So really excited to see his future. David Rodriguez, who finished third, is a player that's had top performances. He's been playing for quite a while now. I remember seeing him back in like 2016, 2017. So cool to see him perform so well. And then we had Esteban Molina, who I think had a really cool team. Like his team felt very like 2012, 2013-esque with like the Cresselia Trick Room with Landers and Heatran as well. So, we were talking about Trick Room earlier. I think he was the only person to really have, represented Trick Room in the top 8 here. So that in itself was really cool to see. And there were a lot of other LATAM names that like I didn't actually necessarily recognize, like because we don't get to see these players play as much, right? Like this is really the one opportunity outside of the World Championships. And so I'm just happy to, see a bunch of newer names rise up to the top as well. Renzo Navarro, for example, an older name, actually won one of the previous Players Cups. He finished the 19th place using a team that was kind of similar to Jamie Boyd's team from Toronto Regionals that had the Grass Ogerpon with Razor Claw as well as the Defiant. And so I thought that was a really cool combination. And then a lot of Brazilian players, of course, in the top 32 as well.
I was talking to Gabriel before the event, as well as Paul Ruiz, because as we hadn't been to Latin America in a while, like I really wanted to get their insight onto some of the best players to really keep an eye out for in terms of their performances at LAIC, but also just in general, maybe some consistency that we get a chance to praise and spotlight. And so alongside the names that you mentioned, Aaron, there's also Hugo Nascimento, who was the first Brazilian player to make it to day 2 of Worlds, playing through day 1. And I thought that was a really unique accomplishment to be able to give a shout out to on the stream. But also even looking at like Daniel Bezerra, solid CAF online. He's part of that larger Brazilian esports team, Zero to Rio, that had a ton of players that were representing that team when at the LAIC. And so there's just a bunch of camaraderie. And James, did you hear in the audience just like how loud the crowd was? Just everybody going vo, 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 vo. Just like at the finals, and also whenever Thiago or just any Brazilian player was playing, I feel like they were all showing support.
Yeah, I remember like it was round 1 super early of even just Pokemon Go, and I think there was like someone from Brazil on stream, and even they were like pretty loud. But I think it was something you had to experience, like actually be at there, because I don't think the camera or the microphones at the venue were able to pick up like how loud and how much energy there was throughout the entire day when there was a person from Brazil playing on stream. Like it was absolutely just insane, and it really makes me wish that like we had those kind of crowds like back in like our own regionals or internationals, because like I don't think I've ever seen like a region so support their own as much as the Latin community, especially the Brazilian community, for their own mods.
See that in a lot of different corners of esports as well. Just the Latin American community is so vibrant and so passionate for their players as well as just their region. And I can't wait to be back in Latin America for the next Latin American National Championships. There's so much that can happen within a year, and I feel like the region as a whole is just getting stronger and stronger. So I can't wait to see how they develop and what can even happen in the next international championships that are leading up to Worlds. But I think that's going to do it for us here on the Beastcoast Pokemon channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in to our recap of the 2024 Latin America International Championships alongside myself, James, and Aaron. There are still a few more events left for Regulation E. We've got the Gdansk Regional Championships in Poland, as well as Stuttgart to round out the European region. And then we have San Antonio Regionals happening in December here for North America. So a lot more action to look forward to, especially as we head over to hopefully what is going to be Regulation F, maybe a little less Urshifu, and also some cool new Pokemon with the new DLC. But that's going to be it for now. Thank you so much. Leave a like and also subscribe, and we'll see you all in the next one.